First Kings chapters 6 through 7. Solomon began to build the temple for the Lord in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of his reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month. The temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. The portico in front of the temple sanctuary was 30 feet long, extending across the temple's width and 15 feet deep in front of the temple. He also made windows with beveled frames for the temple. He then built a chambered structure along the temple wall, encircling the walls of the temple, that is, the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary, and he made side chambers all around. The lowest chamber was 7.5 feet wide, the middle was 9 feet wide, and the third was 10.5 feet wide. He also provided offset ledges for the temple all around the outside so that nothing would be inserted into the temple walls. The temple's construction used finished stones cut at the quarry so that no hammer, chisel, or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. The door for the lowest side chamber was on the right side of the temple. They went up a stairway to the middle chamber, and from the middle to the third. When he finished building the temple, he paneled it with boards and planks of cedar. He built the chambers along the entire temple, joined to the temple with cedar beams. Each story was 7.5 feet high. The word of the Lord came to Solomon. As for this temple you are building, if you walk in my statutes, observe my ordinances, and keep all my commands by walking in them, I will fulfill my promise to you, which I made to your father David. I will dwell among the Israelites and not abandon my people Israel. When Solomon finished building the temple, he paneled the interior temple walls with cedar boards from the temple floor at the surface of the ceiling. He overlaid the interior with wood. He also overlaid the floor with cypress boards. Then he lined 30 feet of the rear of the temple with cedar boards from the floor to the surface of the ceiling, and he built the interior as an inner sanctuary, the most holy place. The temple, that is, the sanctuary in front of the most holy place, was 60 feet long. The cedar paneling inside the temple was carved with ornamental gourds and flowers and flower blossoms. Everything was cedar. Not a stone could be seen. He prepared the inner sanctuary inside the temple to put the Ark of the Lord's covenant there. The interior of the sanctuary was 30 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 30 feet high. He overlaid it with pure gold. He also overlaid the cedar altar. Next, Solomon overlaid the interior of the temple with pure gold, and he hung gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. So he added the gold overlay to the entire temple So he added the gold overlay to the entire temple until everything was completely finished, including the entire altar that belongs to the inner sanctuary. In the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim, 15 feet high, out of olive wood. One wing of the first cherub was 7.5 feet long, and the other wing was 7.5 feet long. The wingspan was 15 feet from tip to tip. The second cherub also was 15 feet. Both cherubim had the same size and shape. The first cherub's height was 15 feet, and so was the second cherub's. Then he put the cherubim beside the inner temple. Since their wings were spread out, the first one's wing touched one wall, while the second cherub's wing touched the other wall. And in the middle of the temple, their wings were touching, wing to wing. He also overlaid the cherubim with gold. He carved all the surrounding temple walls with carved engravings, cherubim, palm trees, and flower blossoms in the inner and outer sanctuaries. He overlaid the temple floor with gold in both the inner and the outer sanctuaries. For the entrance of the inner sanctuary, he made olive wood doors. The pillars of the doorposts were 5-sided. The 2 doors were made of olive wood. He carved cherubim, palm trees, and flower blossoms on them and overlaid them with gold, hammering gold over the cherubim and palm trees. In the same way, he made 4-sided olive wood doorposts for the sanctuary entrance. The 2 doors were made of cypress wood. The first door had 2 folding sides, and the second door had 2 folding panels. He carved cherubim, palm trees, and flower blossoms on them, and overlaid them with gold applied evenly over the carving. He built the inner courtyard with 3 rows of dressed stone and a row of trimmed cedar beams. The foundation of the Lord's temple was laid in Solomon's 4th year in the month of Ziv. In his 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the temple was completed in every detail and according to every specification. So he built it in 7 years. Solomon completed his entire palace complex after 13 years of construction. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. It was 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high on the 4th row of cedar pillars with cedar beams on top of the pillars. It was paneled above with cedar at the top of the chambers that rested on 45 pillars, 15 per row. There were 3 rows of window frames facing each other in 3 tiers. All the doors and doorposts had rectangular frames, the openings facing each other in 3 tiers. He made the hall of pillars 75 feet long and 45 feet wide. A portico was in front of the pillars, and a canopy with pillars was in front of them. He made the hall of the throne, where he would judge, the hall of judgment. It was paneled with cedar from the floor to the rafters. Solomon's own palace, where he would live in the other courtyard behind the wall, was of similar construction. And he made a house like this, hall for Pharaoh's daughter, his wife. All of these buildings were of costly stones, cut to size and sawed with saws on the inner and outer surfaces, from foundation to coping, and from the outside to the great courtyard. The foundation was made of large costly stones, 12 and 15 feet long. Above were also costly stones, cut to size, as well as cedar wood. Along the great courtyard, as well as the inner courtyard of the Lord's temple, and the portico of the temple, were 3 rows of dressed stone and a row of trimmed cedar beams. King Solomon had Hiram brought from Tyre. He was a widow's son from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a bronze craftsman. Hiram had great skill, understanding, and knowledge to do every kind of bronze work. So he came to King Solomon and carried out all his work. He cast 2 bronze pillars, each 27 feet high and 18 feet in circumference. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on top of the pillars. 7.5 feet was the height of the first capital, and 7.5 feet was also the height of the second capital. The capitals on top of the pillars had gratings of lattice work, wreaths made of chain work, 7 of the first capital and 7 for the second. He made the pillars with 2 encircling rows of pomegranates on the one grating to cover the capital on top. He did the same for the second capital, and the capitals on top of the pillars in the portico were shaped like lilies, 6 feet high. The capitals on the 2 pillars were also immediately above the rounded surface next to the grating. And 200 pomegranates were in rows encircling each capital. He set up the pillars at the portico of the sanctuary. He set up the right pillar and named it Jachin. Then he set up the left pillar and named it Boaz. The tops of the pillars were shaped like lilies, and the work of the pillars was completed. He made the cast metal basin 15 feet from brim to brim, perfectly round. It was 7.5 feet high and 45 feet in circumference. Ornamental gourds circled it below the brim, 10 every half yard, completely encircling the basin, and guards were cast in 2 rows when the basin was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The basin was on top of them, and all their hindquarters were toward the center. The basin was 3 inches thick, and its rim was fashioned like the brim of a cup or of a lily blossom. It held 11,000 gallons. Then he made 10 bronze water carts. Each water cart was 6 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 4.5 feet high. This was the design of the carts. They had frames. The frames were between the cross pieces. And on the frames between the cross pieces were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the cross pieces there was a pedestal. Above and below the lions and oxen were wreaths of hanging work. Each cart had 4 bronze wheels with bronze axles. Underneath and 4 corners of the basin were underneath the 4 corners of the basin were cast supports, each next to a wreath, and the water carts opening inside the crown on top was 18 inches wide. The opening was round, made as a pedestal, 27 inches wide. On it were carvings, but their frames were square, not round. There were 404 wheels under the frames, and the wheel axles were part of the water cart. Each wheel was 27 inches tall. The wheels' design was similar to that of chariot wheels. Their axles, rims, spokes, and hubs were all of cast metal. For supports were at the 4 corners of each water cart. Each support was 1 piece with the water cart. At the top of the cart was a band 9 inches high, encircling it. Also, at the top of the cart, its braces and its frames were 1 piece with it. He engraved cherubim, lions, and palm trees on the plates and its braces and on its frames, wherever each had space with encircling wreaths. In this way he made the 10 water carts, using the same casting dimensions and shape for all of them. Then he made 10 bronze basins. Each basin held 220 gallons, and each was 6 feet wide, 1 basin for each of the 10 water carts. He set 5 water carts on the right side of the temple and 5 on the left side. He put the basin near the right side of the temple toward the southeast. Then Hiram made the basins, the shovels, and the sprinkling basins. So Hiram finished all the work that he was doing for King Solomon on the Lord's temple. 2 pillars, bowls for the capitals that were on top of the 2 pillars, the 2 gratings for covering both bowls of the capitals that were on top of the pillars, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 gratings, 2 rows of pomegranates for each grating, covering both capitals, bowls on top of the pillars, the 10 water carts, the 10 basins on the water carts, the basin, the 12 oxen underneath the basin, and the pots, shovels, and sprinkling basins. All the utensils that Hiram made for King Solomon at the Lord's temple were made of burnished bronze. The king had them cast in clay molds in the Jordan Valley between Succoth and Zarethan. Solomon left all the utensils unweighed because there were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined. Solomon also made all the equipment in the Lord's temple: the gold altar, the gold table that the bread of the presence was placed on, the pure gold lampstands in front of the inner sanctuary, 5 on the right and 5 on the left, the gold flowers, lamps, and tongs, the pure gold ceremonial bowls, wick trimmers, sprinkling basins, ladles, and fire pans, and the gold hinges for the doors of the inner temple, that is, the most holy place, and for the doors of the temple sanctuary. So all the work King Solomon did in the Lord's temple was completed. Then Solomon brought in the consecrated things of his father David, the silver, the gold, and the utensils, and put them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple.